This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers lectures 20 to 23 in Seminar 5. We've reached the final section of Seminar 5, titled The Dialectic of Desire and Demand in the Clinical Study and Treatment of the Neuroses. It's a long section, consisting of 9 lectures, and as such, I'll be breaking it up into 2 final videos for this seminar. Whereas in the previous video, I took a lecture-by-lecture approach because it was difficult to synthesize them, lectures 20 to 23 are much more integrated and so will be addressed thematically by first focusing on the dialectic of demand and desire, and then how this dialectic plays itself out in hysterical and obsessional neuroses. As always, we begin with the mythological subject of need. Mythological because it is retroactively presupposed and never directly encountered, except as a demand addressed to the big other. Because when I ask you for something, I'm actually making an appeal to that authority that governs you and not merely to you personally. This big other is both the source of those signifiers I use to express need in the form of demand, but it's also what places demands upon me in such a way that shapes how I make my own demands. Such demands are informed by the laws and prohibitions that are communicated through the big other's speech to the subject. As such, there is a dialectic between the demand of the subject and the demand of the other. Now, not only does the big other fashion signifiers for me, not only does it place demands that shapes my demands, but also it delivers to my speech a signified, or the meaning or message of my demand, that is the object of demand. The child makes a demand, I want this or I want that. The parent interprets this demand not only based on the literal signifiers produced, but also based on what the other finds allowable and lawful. The child asks to eat crayons, I'm going to understand that they are hungry for actual food. In this process, the child then comes to realize the meaning of its own demands as actually being about the food, or this or that object. Now, such objects can be situated at the level of the oral or anal, or what Lacan calls here objects of incorporation, assimilation, and rejection. But ultimately, Lacan states, every demand is ultimately a demand for love. And such objects are tethered to the image of the little other, who either possesses or is identified with this object, and thus serves as a point of rivalry or identification for the subject. The encounter with the image of the little other marks a pivotal point in the life of the subject, one that gets fixated upon in the emergence of perversions, or, as we'll later discuss, gets taken up by the symbolic in a manner that gives rise to unconscious fantasy. This process by which need, expressed through signifiers as demand, becomes signified through an object, creates a loss or residue that is neither equivalent to the mythological original need, nor communicated in speech as a demand, but is the remainder of the difference between the two. And this is desire, the beyond of demand that in some ways still depends on demand to be what it is. This is because the residue or lack gets shaped by what is made present, the demand and its object. Lacan likens the dialectical relationship between desire and demand to Calder's mobiles, which are distinguished by the careful balance of individual components, which allows them to move freely in response to air currents or touch. The resulting effect is a piece of work that is constantly shifting and never static. Desire exists in the gap that speech creates within demand. At the same time, desire is organized by signifiers within which the subject tries to express what is happening in their approach to the signified. So in other words, what fails to get expressed in demand does find another means of communication through the way the signifiers of demand are repeatedly linked up to signifieds of objects. It's through this that we can find those signifiers that have been elided or omitted. However, it's one thing to conceptually identify desire, as Lacan has done here. It's another to say how it is actually encountered by the subject, since this desire often goes unrecognized. how is it recognized? It's not by first encountering it in ourselves, but rather in the other. And we only recognize this desire in the other when we realize that the demand for love and the objects fashioned that we thought would satisfy the other in such a way as to receive that love are in fact unable to satisfy the other. That there is something beyond the other's demand that no object can satisfy that the child fashions, that which the other fundamentally and necessarily lacks, which is the place of the other's desire. This lack in the other gets represented as the signifier of the barred other, and that signifier is here what Lacan means by the phallus. The phallus is the signifier insofar as the other doesn't have it. Lacan also calls it the signifier representing the effects of the signifier on the signified, which can be observed in the manner certain objects become objects of demand, as mentioned already. Desire is not located in the actual demand or the actual object, but in the structural features that link the two together and in the way in which this link never fails to leave something out and thus never truly satisfies. And much of analysis may be thought of as a minding of this manner in which signifiers and signifieds get linked up and the omissions, repetitions, and interruptions that occur along the way of doing so. It's insofar as the subject recognizes the other's barred desire that the subject will recognize their own barred or unsatisfied desire. This is what Lacan calls here the dialectic of recognition. This is critical since it means that the subject's desire must always pass through the desire of the other, that if I fail to recognize the other's desire, I will fail to recognize my own. This point is essential if we are to understand the structural features of neurosis. Now, the subject's desire is represented by these symbols here, the barred subject in relationship to demand. It communicates the subject's relation to demand, or more exactly, that which in the subject is not allowed to enter into demand. This is the incomplete subject that is not merely a subject of knowledge as is talked about in philosophy, but is split between desire and demand and thus impacted by the signifier of the phallus. It's here that fantasy enters as an unconscious attempt to realize this desire. Lacan defines fantasy as the imaginary captured in a particular use of signifiers. Now recall what I said earlier about how in the circuit of demand, the object produced is tethered to the image of the little other, who either is or possesses that object, and with whom the subject establishes a relation of identity and rivalry. Some elements of this encounter, a fragmented image or scene, gets taken up and assumed by signifiers and gives rise to unconscious fantasy. These fantasies are complex scenarios at times that can remain dormant for extended periods of time. And they're often difficult to recognize due to their embeddedness within the signifying function rather than purely in the imaginary, and thus function at the level of the unconscious and so are not the same as what we might consider daydreams or conscious fantasies. They're latent signifying chains within the unconscious that structures and influences the subject and often manifest as symptoms. Now, to appreciate the structural features of neurosis, it's essential to underscore that point that the recognition of the subject's desire requires and depends upon the recognition of the other's desire. It's here a certain dialectical tension arises. Specifically, desire is not only shaped by the other, who acts as a locus for organizing desire through signifiers, but also this very shaping and giving rise to desire is responsible for the inherent alienation of the subject's own desire. It is this tension between desire of subject and desire of other that is principally responsible for producing the development of neurotic structures. In a somewhat long but helpful quote, Lacan states, "The other as locus of speech, insofar as demand is addressed to it, will also be the locus in which desire, or the possible formulation of desire, has to be discovered." This is where a contradiction is constantly operating. for this other is possessed by a desire which inaugurally and fundamentally is alien to the subject. Hence, the difficulties in formulating desire, difficulties at which the subject will stumble, made all the more significant by the fact that we see him developing the neurotic structures that the analytic discovery has made it possible to describe. For hysterics, desire is not about a specific object or person, but first of all, a desire to have a desire to be a point wherein their own desire is called for through the other's desire. As such, the other's desire holds great importance in forming the hysteric's identity and symptoms. And so hysterics live entirely at the level of the other, dependent on the other's desire for their own identity and functioning. And rather than desire an object, the hysterics identify themselves with the object. And their identification with others are identifications as alter egos, perceived as having similar struggles with desire. And this, Lacan says, leads to the characteristic contagious and epidemic expressions of hysteria, which we call sometimes mass hysteria. To help us understand this dynamic, Lacan discusses a case originally presented by Freud entitled here, "The Dream of the Butcher's Beautiful Wife." In that case, a female patient challenged Freud's theory by recounting a dream that, on the surface, appeared to contradict the idea of wish fulfillment. In her dream, she wanted to host a supper, but found herself unable to do so because it was Sunday afternoon, all the shops were closed, and her telephone was out of order, preventing her from calling caterers. Now, in her actual life, the patient had expressed a desire for caviar sandwiches, but refrained from indulging due to the expense. She even asked her husband not to give her caviar so she could tease him about it. So, how does this case, in fact, illustrate the idea of wish fulfillment when intended to illustrate its opposite? According to Lacan, the patient, deeply in love with her husband, is consciously asking for love, but unconsciously desires something else, in this case caviar, which she simultaneously wishes not to receive. The effect of this action is to evoke an unfulfilled desire in her husband, which in turn allows her to sustain herself as a desiring subject. In other words, by creating a situation where the husband experiences his own lack, she prevents him from giving her what she wants. She can recognize the unfulfilled desire in the other that in turn allows her to keep her own desire alive. Thus, Lacan concludes, the desire we encounter from the very first steps of the analysis, and on the basis of which the solution to the puzzle will unfold, is desire as unsatisfied. What we effectively read in the dream is the satisfaction of a wish to have an unsatisfied desire. Lacan goes on to note that it is the structural feature of hysteria wherein a desire that lies beyond all demand plays a prominent role, and the dialectic of desire and demand is, in this case, much more straightforward than we'll see in obsessionals. So where does the symptomatic element come into play here? In this case, it's helpful to take up a second case example Lacan mentions, the case of Dora. And since this case has been described in previous videos a few times before, I won't reiterate its details, only the structural positions of the characters involved. If Dora, as a hysteric, locates her desire in the other's desire to keep her own desire alive, then she must refuse satisfaction of the other's desire. One way this takes place is by identifying with the little other, whose desires appear to be structured in a similar manner. In the dream of the butcher's wife, the patient identifies with a friend of hers of whom she was jealous in real life, and this identification happens in that dream. In the case of Dora, Dora identifies with Herr K, who is thought to share the same object of desire, that being his wife, Frau K. However, such identifications are fragile and subject to fragmentation if there's any disturbance in the structural makeup of the situation due to such identifications being situated on the plane of the imaginary rather than grounded in the symbolic. That disturbance happens once Herr K denies that he loves Frau K, suggesting he loves Dora instead, because Herr K can no longer be sustained through imaginary identifications. Dora finds herself instead identified as an object of exchange between her father and Herr K. And it is this objectification of her being, without the ability to sustain desire through the other's desire, that gives rise to symptomatic expressions in her body. It's not that Dora becomes a hysteric at this point, but that the hysterical clinical structure entails a particular kind of relationship with desire that finds only fragile equilibriums, always teetering on disintegration and symptomatic expression once the situation changes in some way. With the obsessional, we once again take up this dialectic of desire and demand and the dialectic of recognition of desire. But whereas the hysteric emphasizes the place of the other's desire, the obsessional's emphasis is on their own desire and the attempt at destroying the other's desire so as not to depend on it. As already suggested, Lacan thinks the obsessional strategy for dealing with the question of desire is a bit more complicated, as we see this attempt at destroying the other's desire being met with a seemingly contradictory attempt to support the other, now in its function of lawgiver and prohibitor. These two approaches to the other mark the structure of the subject's unconscious fantasy as well, which can be both sadistic in destroying the other and oblative, which entails the satisfaction of the other's desire in a manner that seeks their approval. Perhaps on a conscious level, we might be able to identify some of our daydreams that tap into this, where we imagine ourselves dominating our competition or severely punishing someone with horrifically damaging words who maybe has injured us. At other times, we might imagine accomplishing great feats of heroism or professional success in a manner that receives high praise from others we hold in very high esteem. Again, we don't want to too closely connect conscious fantasy with unconscious fantasy, because that can be very misleading, but only by analogy am I suggesting it here. Now, how are these seemingly contradictory fantasies related? I think it's important to recall four things to understand what's happening here. First, the subject's desire is dependent on the recognition of the other's desire, but the obsessive seeks to keep their desire alive by bypassing the other's desire. Two, keeping a desire alive means keeping it unsatisfied. Three, the objects of demand are always frustrating because they fail to satisfy. 4, demand articulated by the subject is shaped by the demand of the other, which is how objects or the signifieds of the other emerge. So what kinds of demands then are we going to make to preserve an unsatisfied desire if we're an obsessional neurotic? We're going to make some very fixed, rigid demands that require objects that are very difficult to obtain. Making such demands, since our demands are dependent on the demands of the other, requires support of the big other in its function as superego with its imposition of laws and prohibitions. It's the prohibitions that, in fact, sustain desire by inducing a demand for a difficult or impossible to reach object. The superego presence creates a high, sometimes insurmountable bar wherein it becomes nearly impossible to obtain the permission of the big other to enjoy. As such, obsessionals engage in very demanding tasks and exploits, not primarily for personal achievement or satisfaction, but to gain permission or recognition from the other, who is the ultimate spectator and validator of the obsessional's actions. Lacan uses the example of the individual who works in order to earn a good vacation. But when the vacation comes, they are unable to enjoy it because they are racked with guilt for not working. This keeps desire alive, in a certain sense, by keeping satisfaction at bay. For the obsessional, work is powerful, being done so as to free up the time for sailing, which will be holiday time. And the holidays habitually turn out to be more or less wasted. Why? Because what it was about was obtaining the other's permission. And yet at the same time, the obsessional subject does not want to see their own desire as dependent upon the desire of the other. Instead, they seek what is seemingly an autistic desire, a desire that is self-generated, self-sustained, and self-satisfied. It is a manner of masking one's castration. As such, whereas the hysteric subject attempts to destroy themselves by becoming an object for the other's satisfaction, the obsessional subject attempts to destroy others by reducing them to objects. However, this is where the obsessional subject ends up in all sorts of contradictions and where obsessional neurosis is a bit more complex than hysteria. Hysteria, in a sense, works with the truth of desire, that their desire is the other's desire, but they fail to achieve any kind of separation from that desire. Obsessional neurosis, however, fundamentally misrecognizes what desire is and misrecognizes it as something autonomous and self-generated when in fact it is always dependent upon the other's desire. The hysteric understands they don't have the phallus and wants to make sure the other encounters this lack as well so that the hysteric can keep their own lack alive. The obsessional tries to mask his own castration, pretending to have it when in fact he does not, while also trying to destroy the other's lack so as not to have to encounter it in themselves. So in real life, what we find is often this approach avoidance relationship to objects. We really want the thing, but then we destroy the thing when it is available to us, so as to not thoroughly enjoy it. One more video for Seminar 5, and then we can finally move on to Seminar 6. It's been a while, but I'm looking forward to moving to the next seminars. We've been with this one for a good while now. So thank you, everyone. If you want to support this work, you can do so by liking and subscribing to the channel, sharing this video. You can also support it financially through the super thanks option below or over on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts, unedited materials, and prioritize questions and comments here on YouTube. The link is below. So until that next video, be well.